Welcome to Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm Adam Dixon. I'm the Adam Smith Chair in Sustainable Capitalism here at Panmure House and Heriot-Watt University. Today we are going to award the Panmure House Prize, and I have the privilege of introducing you to the chair, or our chair for this afternoon, Sir John Kay. But before I do that, I'd like to thank the sponsors of the prize, which is Bailey Gifford, and also to recognize FCLT Global for assisting us in running the prize. Now, Sir John Kay, I would say, is one of the leading British economists, someone who has written numerous books, wrote for the Financial Times, has been a professor at Oxford, and when you get a chance to talk to him, he is a very, very funny man with a dry sense of humor. Why I mention that is because John is just a great individual, as you will see. He has a book coming out in 2024, which I'd like to plug, The Corporation of the 21st Century, which will be published this August. And the reason why I'm plugging that is because we hope to have an event here sometime when the book is out to present that book. So on that note, I will let John come and present the speaker or the prize winner for today. Please, John.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you all for being with us here this afternoon, both in person and online. We're here to award the 2023 Panmure House Prize to Joseph Henrich. But before we do that, I know many of you will have been in Panmure House before, but for those of you who haven't, I'll remind you that the house was built in 1691. The name of the house derives from the Earls of Panmure, who built it, but of course it's famous because it was the residence of Adam Smith for the last 12 years of his life. And during these 12 years, Smith completed the final editions of his two great works, Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations. In this house also, Smith entertained the great figures of the Scottish Enlightenment. The house fell into disrepair. In 2008, it was bought by Edinburgh Business School and Heriot-Watt University, who rescued it from dereliction, restored it, and in 2018, it was reopened with the idea that it would be the centre of a new enlightenment, and we hope to make a contribution towards that enlightenment this afternoon. We want to bring together thought leaders, policymakers, etc. The Panmure House is an annual award of $75,000 made possible by Bailey Gifford. The purpose of the award is to support and fund research to explore the relationship between long-term thinking and radical innovation. And the idea is that it should go to emerging leaders in academia and to enable research that embodies Smith's own approach to empiricism and long-term thinking. The opportunity is open to academics in and across all disciplines, and their entries are shortlisted and judged by our specially appointed Panmure House Prize panel, of which I chair. And joining us online for this are Sarah Williamson of FCLT Global in Boston, David Bitt-Watson, Ranuzi Mukati, and Professor Dame Heather McGregor, Vice Principal of Heriot-Watt University in Dubai. And in the room we also have Adam Dixon, as you met, and Alan E. from FTC Global. So, today we're awarding the prize to Dr. Joseph Henrich, who holds the Ruth Moore Professorship in Biological Anthropology in the Department of Evolutionary Biology at Harvard. And prior to Harvard, he served as professor in economics and psychology at the University of British Columbia for nearly a decade, holding a research chair there. After earning his PhD, he was honoured with the Presidential Early Career Award for Young Scientists and Engineers by the National Science Foundation, and multiple subsequent accolades. He was Canadian Senior Fellow at the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, and in 2023, Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium's leading university, awarded him an honorary doctorate. What Dr. Henrich does is to employ evolutionary theory to explore the relationship between human psychology, cultural evolution, and genetic evolution. And through that lens, he's investigated various topics, including economic decision-making, social norms, fairness, religion, marriage, kinship, prestige, cooperation, and innovation. I first came across Dr. Henrich and his work when in his 2016 book, The Secret of Our Success. I have to confess, I heard about it at a seminar where someone said, if there's one book you should read this year, it is The Secret of Our Success. I confess I was a bit surprised at that, because I thought that sounds like a self-help manual, or if it's not a self-help manual, it's a book about how to 7 useful tips for running your business better starting on Monday morning. And I don't have much interest in either of these. But nevertheless, I picked up a copy and I realized it was the most important book I could read that year. And what I learned about that was the importance of the secret of our success as a human species, which was the acquisition of collective knowledge and the development of that into collective intelligence. The idea that we could know more about things as a group than any of us could know individually, that none of us know much about everything or everything about anything, but our collective intelligence is far greater than that. There is literally nobody in the world who knows how to build an aeroplane, but 10,000 people working together do. And that's the transmission of collective intelligence into collective knowledge into collective intelligence. And that contrasts with what's I think the much more prevalent great man theory of innovation, that Newton sits there under the tree, the apple falls, and he thinks, aha, gravitation. Actually, we would be flying today even if Orville Wright had never been born. And even if Steve Jobs had not helped create the smartphone, we would certainly be wandering around with mini computers in our pockets, even if they were rather different kinds of mini computer than the ones we actually have. All of these things were the creation of the development over long periods of time of collective knowledge into collective intelligence. And that's what I learned from Joe Henrich, and I think it's immensely important and immensely useful. Joe's most recent book is called The Weirdest People in the World. He talks about weird, meaning wealthy, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. That's not what people ordinarily mean by weird. But in these terms, we're sitting in a country that is one of the weirdest countries in the world. And the evolution of that weirdness in Scotland from the end of the 16th, beginning of 17th century to the end of the 19th century is one of the most interesting stories of human development, I think. It's a story of economic development in which a desperately poor country on the periphery of Europe was transformed into what, by the end of the 19th century, was one of the richest, if not the richest, parts of the world. It was also an intellectual period of intellectual development when this extraordinary Scottish Enlightenment of the 18th century, of which Smith and Panmure House were a part, gave rise to ideas that have changed the world and influenced the way everyone subsequently thinks. There was an industrial revolution, there was a trade and colonial revolution, and there was an intellectual revolution. And all of that happened here in Scotland in these 3 centuries. That's the growth of what Joe calls the weird culture. Poor primitive country became one of the richest in the world through the development of collective knowledge and the application of collective intelligence. Adam Smith made a great contribution to that, and Joe Henrich has made a contribution in a similar vein and of a similar kind. So I'm very privileged to be here today to honour Joe Henrich, and I'm now going to give him a chance to describe some of his ideas to you. Joe.
Well, thanks for that generous, kind introduction. It's great to be with you all today. It's a real honor to be here with you today to celebrate Adam Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment. Let's see. So what I want to talk about today is this idea that I began developing in my 2016 book that Sir John mentioned, The Collective Brain. And I want to have a particular application today that'll take us into my second book, my 2020 book, The Weirdest People in the World. So I want to go back to Adam Smith's original question, why are some nations rich and others poor? Or the way the question is sometimes put in economics, why did the Industrial Revolution happen in Europe, Britain, and not in China, India, or Iraq? In The Weirdest People in the World, I point out that if there had been aliens in orbit in the year 1000 and you asked them which of these various regions of the world was going to come to dominate the world 500, 1,000 years later, they might have picked China or the Middle East, the Islamic world, but they wouldn't have selected this remote corner of Europe. So what happened there? Just to remind you, the Industrial Revolution, so this is 1800, and there's 2000. This is income per capita adjusted for purchasing power. And you just see this substantial increase in the amount of income per person. You can see it in life expectancy statistics. You could also look at it in infant mortality, these dramatic changes over 200 years. So, and to explain these kind of changes, you need to be able to explain the pouring out of an immense number of kinds of innovations, including not just steam engines like James Watt would have invented over in Glasgow, but also vaccines, inoculations, organizational innovations, and other sorts of things. So to get at this, and now I'm talking about the kinds of things that Sir John mentioned with the myth of the great genius or the myth of the heroic inventor. So we tend to think about innovations as being the products of these special brains that we have on our heads. And so I think there's both a myth of the heroic brain, which is what makes us special as humans, that it's something about the 86 billion neurons in our heads, and the heroic genius, the Isaac Newton, that we need to explain. And just to give you a couple of examples of statements. So this is the renowned physicist Michel Kaku. He's a physicist in New York, and he points out, he's emphasizing the brain, the 100 million neurons, it was a little bit off, but connecting to another 10,000 neurons sitting on your shoulders is the most complicated object in the known universe. I think the problem is it's too zoomed in. We need to zoom out and think about the fact that all of our minds, or many of our minds, are connected in a larger structure that's not always visible to us. And Professor Musk over here, Elon Musk, on Twitter recently said, humans are weaker and slower than other animals. If not for intelligence, we'd be long since have died out. Intelligence has obviously been the primary evolutionary vector for humans. What is underappreciated is how much has happened in the last 10,000 years. There was an intelligence explosion 6,000 years ago with the sudden development of writing, agriculture, elementary math, which none of those happened 6,000 years ago. There was the wheel. That's the only thing I could think of that happened 6,000 years ago. But that aside, so I think this is a view that puts the emphasis on the intelligence in the individual mind. So I want to shift things and ask the question of what makes us human. So the first kind of primer I want to give you to get started here is this, and this is what I want to show Elon, which is that this is 30,000 years ago, and this is now. This is 15,000 years ago, and this is the amount of social development. So here I'm drawing data from Ian Morris, who's a historian. And he's tried to calculate the ability of society. So this is the most complex society on Earth. I just took whatever the highest was. And how much energy they can capture, how technologically sophisticated they are, how good their farming is, whether they have writing, those kinds of things. And you can see there's this dramatic increase that's exponential after about 5,000 years ago. So this is what Elon is thinking of. But at the same time, human brains have been shrinking. Most people don't know that. Our brains are smaller than Neanderthals of some 50,000 years ago, and we have this gradual decline. I fit a cubic just because it looked better, fit better. But so you might think there was a decline and then maybe another decline, but whatever you think, it's going fastest most recently. When most of the action happened, when math was developed and all these things, our brains are actually shrinking. Now, a typical thing, well, the first thing you have to realize is that in primates, so these are all different primate species, and this is the performance of these different species on what we could call global cognitive tests. This is what anybody would call intelligence. Bigger brains, better on those cognitive tests. So humans, which are at the far end of this, have been getting worse on those cognitive tests if this holds across human species. And now a lot of people, the typical reaction is, well, maybe something cool happened. There was some genetic change that made our brains have more bang for the buck. But work by the neuroscientist Susanna Herculina Housel analyzes the details of how many brains are in each section of our brain and what the interconnections are. And her conclusion is human brains are just scaled up monkey brains. It's no different from a monkey brain except that it's bigger. So it looks like we just have scaled up monkey brains. So this should pose a question. What's going on? Why do we seem so smart in the modern world? That's that point. So the point I want to make is that actually while our individual brains were shrinking, our collective brains were getting bigger. We had larger societies living in denser agglomerations, sharing ideas across larger spaces. Now I want to give you an example to kind of put this in perspective relative to other animals. A typical thing is that we're much smarter than other animals. And one of the ways I like to shake people's confidence on this is to tell them about lost European and sometimes American explorers who find themselves stranded in an environment where humans have lived successfully for centuries or millennia as hunter-gatherers. And this has happened repeatedly. And what always happens is they struggle to survive. Even if they have like weeks of food initially, they struggle to survive. They can't make any tools. They can't travel. They can't treat the conditions they get. They turn to cannibalism sometimes, and they die unless they connect with the locals. And they can learn a few things from the locals and survive. And even sometimes that doesn't happen. In the case of this is Robert Burke, who famously got stranded in Central Australia, and he had brought camels with him, some of whom escaped. Burke and Wills died, but the camels survived and actually went on to make baby camels, and now there's lots of camels in Australia. You might say, well, that's an easy one. Well, scientists and researchers had to transport a bunch of monkeys from Puerto Rico where they had them at a research station. These were monkeys that had never lived in the wild, and they just dropped them onto Morgan Island, which is an island off the coast of South Carolina. Morgan Island is now covered with 4,000 monkeys. So the monkeys did great. The survivors of the folks in Roanoke, in the lost colony of Roanoke, did not do so well, which is nearby. So humans just don't seem to do as well as other animals. If we look at a little bit of evidence comparing humans with other apes. So these are 2.5-year-old children who are competing on a battery of 18 cognitive tests with orangutans and chimpanzees. And you can see that these are how many they got right, basically, how well they did. The human children are not much better than the chimpanzees, and the orangutans are only a little bit worse. But the one domain in which the human children completely dominate is their ability to learn from others. So they're at ceiling and the apes are at floor. So it seems like the children are really good at learning from other people, at acquiring this storehouse of knowledge that accumulates in humans that we don't see very much of happening in other species. So this tells me that something else is afoot besides us just having big brains that allow us to solve problems. It's something about the accumulation of culture operating over generations where we can learn lots of stuff. So imitation. And we culturally download a lot of stuff. Yeah, so I think to get at Adam Smith's questions about the poverty and wealth of nations, we need to get human nature correct. And part of that is figuring out what the secret of our success is and what our big brains are for. They don't seem to be for making us better at individually solving problems or building causal models of how the world works. I could regale you with lots of examples from the secret of our success of things, adaptive practices that people have like spicing in foods or their use of rituals or putting ash in the cassava mix or in the mix before you make tortillas that are highly adaptive, but the people themselves don't understand why they do it, or they have the wrong theory about why they do it. But it turns out to be adaptive. Well, we seem to be really good as learning from others. So our big brains are for acquiring, storing, and organizing all this information that we can tap into from the minds of others. From this perspective, innovation by recombination is a natural part of the process. I learned a little bit from one person how to do it, a little bit from another, and then I make something new by putting those together. It happens very naturally. Okay. So just to give you a little bit more footing on what I mean by making us smarter, think about these basic machines. So springs, screws, and levers. Not all human societies have them, lots of societies don't. But if you grow up in a society that has them, you can play with them and learn how to use them, you can see what they're used for, and you can figure out ways to redeploy them in new contexts. And so once you have these in your head, then that gives you a whole new set of things you can do. One of my favorite examples is the wheel. So a lot of people think the wheels were used way back into human evolutionary history. Gary Larson has Neanderthals using wheels. Actually relatively late in human history. So it's the one that Professor Musk got right. 6,000 years ago, wheels appear. They're used on carts, and then they're used in pottery. But this is only in Eurasia. They don't appear in Australia, New Guinea, Oceania, and they only appear on Mayan toys in the entire New World. So no carts, and there were plenty of animals to make use of these because there were dogs everywhere, and you can use dogs to pull carts. Elastically stored energy, it doesn't appear in Australia at all. That's why you have boomerangs and atlatls. And New Guinea invents bows and arrows, but no fletching. So variation in the use of elastically stored energy. And something like a numbering system. So you've all inherited a numbering system that allows you to count without bound. But that's far from a given in humans. Groups like the Machigenga that I lived with count 1, 2, 3 many. So if you have to compare 36 and 37 coconuts, it's difficult to do. The counting systems are usually something like this one, where they first develop as the name for each of these digits, and the digits will have an order. So that's the word for thumb means 1, the word for index finger means 2, etc. And then you'll have a word for this, and a word for this, and a word for this, and that's your numbering system. And then sometimes people learn to duplicate it, and it works like that. Finally, I'll mention 0. It's kind of a non-intuitive one because here you have something, a 0, that stands for nothing. Only invented twice in human history, once in India and once among the Maya. Europeans get 0 from Arabs who entered Spain, and then 0 works its way in that way. Okay, and then lots of other terms that give us a richer and richer set of tools to think and reason with. Now, I'm trying to make an evolutionary case here, and one of the unfortunate and persistent views of this, even within the social science today, is that you have genetic evolutionary explanations on one side, and then cultural or learning-based explanations on the other side. But for decades now, we've known the solution to that problem, to dissolve that intellectually destructive dichotomy, and that's to recognize that we've evolved through natural selection, acting on our genes and on our brains, to make us a species who relies heavily on learning from others. So as I mentioned, those little kids come into the world programmed to learn, to acquire all the things they need to learn. So even by age 1, children have a little bit of language, and they can start to make words and understand what's going on around them. We seem to have a period of middle childhood when we learn social norms, when we begin to internalize them. So that's part of human life history. And so you want to think about this as shaping our cognitive capacities, and then that leads to cultural evolution, and then eventually that feeds back, and that's gene culture coevolution. So lots of products like cooking and fire are things that we can only know how to learn, and they've been around for 1,000,000 years, but they've shaped our physiology and biology. So you can't understand human guts and human teeth without recognizing we're a cooking species, but if I were to deposit all of you into the nearby forests, you'd be unlikely to be able to make a fire without some tools or technology. You just don't know how to do it intuitively and innately. Okay, so just to give you a sense of how we can build up a theory of human cultural evolution, we can take the logic of natural selection and say, how should natural selection have shaped our minds to make us best able to extract the ideas, beliefs, values, and practices from those in our social milieu? So to give you a sense, imagine you're a young member of a group or an immigrant, and you're trying to figure out what to eat. So this is a basic problem that animals have to solve. You might have innate taste cues that you go around the environment sampling stuff and then you start eating more of what tastes good. That's one way to do it. Lots of animals do it. The camels probably did it that way in Australia. But another way is to focus on the older, healthier, and more successful members of your group and eat whatever they eat. That jumps you to a good solution to the problem relatively quickly, and you can play around once you get to a basic diet. So that's just one basic approach. Another is to, so that first one, that's called model-based learning. That's where you're particular about who in your cultural world you learn from. Another are content-based mechanisms, where you pay attention to certain kinds of things and process information in certain ways. So a simple one is food. People everywhere in the world seem to be interested in food. They attend to things about food. They ask questions about food. Fire. There seems to be a stage in children growing up when they get really interested in fire. And they kind of get obsessed with it, and then once they master it, they move on. Artifacts. We think about artifacts in a way that's different from other kinds of things. I could tell you similar things about social norms, social groups, and living kinds in general. So we seem to have some content-based ways of thinking. Now, going back to our model-based cues, so what do we look for in the social world? So people have hypothesized, and we found evidence for using skill and competence, so you learn from more successful and competent members, or more skilled and competent members. We could use success. So this is more of an aggregate. So if you're trying to become a good hunter, skill would be learning from the person whose arrows tend to hit the target most frequently. But success might be who brings back the most big prey. And prestige would be who do the other good hunters think is the best hunter, right? So you're just using their cues. They might listen to them, defer to them in speech, something like that. Young children will copy more healthier children and also ones who show positive affect. Age is an important cue. So older children are, being older means that you are more likely to have information. So that means you might have a bias to learn from older individuals. And children especially might be cued to learn from older children because it's a way of scaffolding up your skill. So if you want to become you want to become the best hunter, say, and you're 7, it wouldn't do you any good to copy the best 36-year-old hunter, who's the best hunter in the village, say. You should focus on the best 9-year-old. And then once you get to be 9, you can focus on the best 12-year-old, and you can scaffold your skills up that way. And then finally, there's evidence for self-similarity. So you want to get those cultural traits that are best suited to the world you're likely to occupy in the future. And anthropologists have long argued that the sexual division of labor between males and females is old, probably 1 million years old. So as a consequence, when we look at babies and young children, females tend to copy females, and males, males. And this even can be seen in toddlers before they can accurately tell you what gender they are. They'll tend to copy the boy. The boys will tend to copy boys, and the girls will tend to copy girls. People, or children and adults, tend to preferentially learn from, and this happens unconsciously, those who speak like mom, those who speak mom's language or mom's dialect. So it's cueing you into the traits you're likely to need to interact with others later in life. Okay, and then the bigger picture here is that individuals aggregate these to figure out who in their environment to pay attention to. I could show you pages and pages of evidence in infants, children, and adults across an incredibly wide range of domains. So I like domains like the diffusion of suicide or of economic practices or of food choices, but it's an incredibly wide range of areas. Okay, now one of the reactions I sometimes get when I talk about that is people are they're willing to say, okay, yeah, regular people do that, but what about the creative people? They're the ones who are buckling down and thinking for themselves, right? But what I want to argue is that most ideas are recombination. So something that explains a lot of creativity in creative individuals is promiscuously putting together lots of ideas, some of which turn out to be stupid, and also pulling ideas from further away. Because those are less likely to be useful, but they're also more likely to give you a lot of bang for the buck if you put together unlikely ideas, combinations that other people wouldn't put together, recombining more distant ideas. And related to this, I wanted to link this to data I'm going to use later when I'm trying to get down to innovation and how we can understand that. So this is from the US Patent Database. And one of the ways we see cultural evolution appearing in the US Patent Database is that if your father has a patent, you're as a kid, you're 9 times more likely to patent. Now you might think, well, smart fathers have smart sons, right? But the thing is, you tend to patent in the exact same narrow technology domain as your father. So this is your likelihood of patenting in the same domain as dad, And that's the second closest domain is dad. So it's mostly in the same domain, but then you're much more likely to be in one of the nearby domains, and then it kind of flattens out there at the bottom. So if dad patented in transistors, you're patented in transistors probably. Now, it's not just vertical cultural transmission, parent to child. It also depends on where you grew up. So these are different parts of the United States, and this is the patenting rate in the adults when you were a kid. So where you grow up matters for whether you're going to patent. If you grew up in a place where there's a lot of patenting, that's Silicon Valley. There's Boston, Minneapolis. You're much more likely to patent than if you grow up in Brownsville. There's Nashville, Honolulu. And the same applies. If you grow up in San Jose, you're probably going to patent in computers. But if you grow up in Boston, it's probably going to be biotech. So it follows out the same pattern. So, you're getting some stuff from dad, parents, and you're getting some stuff from your local social milieu, from your peers, and you put all that together. I could show you the same thing for where you go to university. So if you go to MIT, you're much more likely to patent than if you go to many other places. Even if you go to Harvard, which is right down the street. Okay, I wanted to kind of give you a solid example that illustrates these points. So you may recognize these fellas. That's Larry Page and Sergey Brin. I just checked the list. They're number 10 and 11 richest people in the world, so I guess they've dropped. So they are the inventors of the Google algorithm, the foundation of Google that we still use. It's a classic innovation in the sense that it's a recombination of two ideas. One is a web crawler, and so these guys go to graduate school at Stanford in the mid-1990s. Everybody's using web crawlers. It already exists. It's a known technology. They combine it with popularity page ranking. So academics know all about this, right? That's how we value our papers. How many citations do you have? What's the impact of the journal, which is based on citations to that journal? Now, you might say, well, they got that idea. Where'd they get it? Mom and dad. Larry's parents are two computer scientists, and his older brother was already building a social network company that got sold to Yahoo. Yahoo was started by some of their classmates at Stanford. So the parents are academics. Sergey is a Russian immigrant with Jewish parents. His father is an academic mathematician. Mother was an engineer that worked at NASA. So in both of these households, popularity ranking based on citations was in the air, so to speak. So what they did is take this idea and put it together with the web crawlers everybody else was using, and then it was Google. There was some serendipity involved. There's almost always serendipity involved. We'll leave that aside. How they met is the serendipity. Now, you might think that these guys are the geniuses. I'm not criticizing them. I mean, they're as smart as anybody. You might think that they're the geniuses who put this together. But as with many innovations, there was another guy who had the exact same idea, actually patented a year earlier. So Robin Lee was a Chinese immigrant working in New Jersey at Dow Jones, and he has a patent with the US government for a very similar algorithm. When Dow Jones wasn't interested in his algorithm, he went back to China, and he now owns Google's major competitor in China that dominates the Chinese market. Basically the same idea. Now, you might think, well, these guys, they had this bold vision, but by their own accounts, they didn't know that they were inventing a search engine. They were inventing a catalog or a map, they thought. And there was no vision at the time, so you might remember, the older members of the group might remember AltaVista or Excite, these other search engines people were using back then. They tried to sell their idea to these other companies for $1 million. $1 million in Silicon Valley is not very much money. They all declined, and in several cases they said, search is not important. We know search is not important. So they were forced to start their own company in the garage of a physics professor from Stanford, and then the rest is history. Okay. Oh, Dow Jones wasn't interested in Lee's patent for the same reason. Okay, so that gives you a little picture of innovation, but that's a story of lots and lots of innovations. So most things are recombinations or modifications of existing ideas. Once that's true, and we have people doing social learning, this actually follows. So larger populations are going to generate more recombinations. Populations with more cognitive diversity are going to have more material to recombine. And individuals have to be socially interconnected in order to create this. So all three of these work together to generate more combinations and more inventions. So just to give you a rough sense to get you thinking about the way I'm thinking about this, something like urbanization is going to increase innovation. Just because people are closer together, they have more opportunities to interact, that one follows. Economic historians, I'm thinking here of Joel Mokyr and David Delacroix, have argued that Europe had an advantage based on its apprenticeship going back into medieval period, because apprentices could move around and didn't have a kin-based system. So journeymen, for example, had to study, become certified in a sense, and then they had to go work like a postdoc. They had to go work somewhere else, which meant they were taking their know-how from one place and going to another master and then recombining, so to speak. Things like postal services and cheap transportation can also create this effect. But I'm more interested in the softer stuff, so the psychology. So in order to make this system run, you have to trust and be willing to cooperate with strangers, or at least tolerate them enough to have idea transmission. Individualism helps because you approach people as individuals rather than as groups. Novelty, preference, breaking with tradition can all help. And of course, any tolerance of differences. So we'll take a focus on psychological factors. So now we're getting into some meat of it that matters for the modern world. So I'm going to use patterns as a proxy. I'm going to move to creative individuals partway through. These things tell the same story. There's lots of obvious problems with using patterns, but it's the best data we have, and I can show you lots of confirmatory evidence that even though you might think it's not perfect, it correlates with all the other things you think it should. Okay, so these are patterns around Europe from 1980 to 2024. You can see my collaborators down there. Okay, so we have 1,474 regions around Europe, and we have measures of psychology from these different regions. So Sir John mentioned the acronym WEIRD, so Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. There's this interesting psychological variation around the world and within Europe. So we're just focusing within Europe, so this is and I'm going to use only variation within countries. So we're not going to worry about differences in national health care, national wealth, or anything like that. We can get measures from a European Social Survey of universal trust, universal fairness, individualism, and nonconformity. What the map here is an aggregate, so if you do what's called a principal components analysis, you look for how things are correlated and you give it one number. And we can use that to predict the patterns. And what we find is that little regions of Europe that have a weirder psychology, so more trust, more fairness, more individualism, and more nonconformity, get more patterns per capita. So this is all per capita, so it's as if people are getting smarter, holding the country constant. Now, probably many of you will know what a standard deviation, but not everyone. One standard deviation increase in psychology for any of these single traits gives you about a quarter to almost a half standard deviation increase in the other one. That's a pretty big effect. And if you put them all together, you get 0.62 increase in patterns per capita. And again, only comparing within countries. So that's kind of interesting that there's this psychological correlation. Related to the collective brain, we could also take the number of Facebook friends that you have that are more than 100 miles away. So you have far-reaching friends. Regions where people have far-reaching friends are more likely to have or have more patterns per capita. So that's consistent with the collective brain. And this one is maybe more intriguing and less obvious, unless you've read The Weirdest People in the World, is that the number of single nuclear families is associated with more patterns per capita. Now, one way to have this picture is if you live in places with many nuclear families, there's lots of different kinds of people in different groups, and so you're more likely to reach out and make more distant connections, which leads to greater innovation. All right, we're going to come back to those in a second. Because now we have to back up. Okay, so there's this variation. Why is there psychological variation around Europe? Because that's going to be the key to explaining the rest of this. So I've shown you these two. So the cultural psychology and family networks seem to be associated with innovation. And in The Weirdest People in the World, I argue that this is really premised on kinship norms, which is why the monogamous nuclear family is important. So where you have more monogamous nuclear families, you get more of these distant social networks, and you get more of this psychology based on trust and fairness and individualism and whatnot, which leads to innovation. But then why does this vary? So, well, some of you may know about this, but beginning in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, the Catholic Church began a program that I call the Marriage and Family Program. It ends polygyny, it ends arranged marriage. It basically dismantles the tribes and clans of Europe and breaks them down into monogamous nuclear families. So we're going to use the amount of time that the medieval church has been to explain the rest of this story. So that's my starting point. It's specifically the Western Catholic Church. because, so one idea, this is maybe it's Christianity. This doesn't work very well for Eastern Christianity. It doesn't work for Coptic Christianity or Syrian Christianity or any of those other things. It's specifically the group under the Pope. Okay, now another way I've tested this is there's ecological factors that also change these, and so you can run this way. So I have work looking at China that does that, but for the purposes of Europe, you need to know about Catholicism. This is kind of a fun thing because I'm eventually going to tell you that more time under the Catholic Church leads to more innovation. It's kind of one of these non-intuitive ideas that I like. And as a first pass, you should be skeptical about that because if you just run the correlation, more religiosity is associated with less innovation, right? So that's kind of the default. Many of you may not know much about kin-based institutions. So anthropologists have long argued for the centrality of kin-based institutions. They're the single most important thing you find when you look across diverse human societies. And they're rooted, one of the reasons they're important is they're rooted in basic aspects of human nature. So first is our tendency to be altruistic towards and to be positively inclined towards our blood relatives. Now, cultural evolution has taken this and expanded it and built things like clans and kindreds and done all kinds of interesting things to create social networks. But it's rooted in our evolved psychology. Another feature of our evolved psychology is pair bonding. This is the foundation of marriage, that there's this emotional bond between mates that's and gorillas have pair bonds too, and it's for the purposes of raising children. Male gorillas that provides protection. But culture, of course, builds heavily on that, and you get a whole marriage system across diverse societies. And then finally, incest aversion. So all animals have to deal with the problem of inbreeding, and humans seem to have innate avoidance of close relatives, brothers and sisters and whatnot. But societies have built incest taboos, which most people think incest taboos on brothers and sisters. That's not where the action is. The action on incest taboos is toward cousins and uncles and things like that, other kinds of relatives. So it prevents marriages and mating between sort of non-primary families, what incest taboos do. Okay, so this is all structuring social networks in a very primary way. All right, now if that seems foreign to you or odd, this would be so important, it's because you were probably born and raised in a society that has the weakest kinship of any society that anthropologists have explored. So you're at the far end of the distribution on this. And just to give you a sense of this, this is data from the Ethnographic Atlas, which is a compilation of over 1,200 societies where anthropologists have recorded facts about diverse societies. So the first one up there is bilateral descent. That's descent, you trace descent for a kid from both mother and father. And so you recognize both sides of the family. Most societies don't have that. So only 28% of societies have that. So weird societies are within that 28%. Little or no cousin marriage. 3/4 of societies have cousin marriage. It's either prescribed, or it's either prescribed, meaning it's good, or permitted if people want to do it. Most societies have allowed high status and elite men to marry additional wives. So what's unusual in a global perspective is monogamous marriage, where you're prevented, you can only have one wife for one husband at a time. Nuclear families are very rare, so 95% of societies don't have nuclear families as a solo thing. And then neolocal residence, that's where you have to live independent of either the groom's family or the bride's family. You set up your own house, and most societies don't have that either. So if you add all these up, just to give you a sense of how unusual European kinship is, this is the number of societies in the Ethnographic Atlas with none of these. So most societies, this is a little over 50% here, don't have any of these kinds of kinship practices. And the ones that look like Europe are here. That's with all 5. And those, what's in there is either European descent societies, or, I went in and I traced every single society down. Or they're societies that were Christianized early. So for example, Cebu, the island of Cebu in the Philippines is in that 5. But that's because Magellan got there in 1521 and started complaining about the polygyny and the cousin marriage. And then after Magellan, Dominican friars came and been cracking down on Cebu for a long time. So they have a weird kinship system now. Same thing with parts of the West, the places where the Spanish got to early, like New Mexico and things like that. Okay, so family should be important because ontogenetically, in terms of human development, that's the first institution you encounter as a human is the family. And historically, it's the oldest institution. So long before there were governments or anything like that, there were family structures, clans, things like that. And in a sense, you already know that the church was involved in this in some way. So in English, we have the term sister-in-law. What's the in-law? Why is it in law? Whose law? Canon law. She's your sister in canon law. Treat her like a sister, no sex or marriage. Okay, and this is part of a set of incest taboos imposed by the Catholic Church that eventually becomes part of the language. So if you look at Anglo-Saxon or older dialects of German, they have a whole different set of kin terminology. What you see is over the end of the early Middle Ages and high Middle Ages, English and other Germanic dialects change, and they get this kind of terminology. English is the only one where it's sort of stamped in law. It just, the term changes in a way that's consistent with this. So they start banning cousin marriages, eventually going out to banning 6 cousins, which is, anybody who you think could possibly be related to you. It's also embedded in our marriage ceremonies. So some of you may have been to weddings where at one point the preacher or priest or some religious official in Christianity says, if anyone here can show just cause while this couple cannot be lawfully joined together in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. And there's a pause. Nobody says anything, hopefully. And then he presses on. That's an incest inquest. It's getting everyone together and saying, let's just do a double check. These two aren't related, right? And so this is the priest trying to make sure that cousins aren't marrying, because this was thought to be a really bad thing. Of course, polygyny is banned, no sex slaves, those are banned. Arranged marriages are banned. This is why Christian brides have to say, I do. Normally, no one checks with the bride. But and it's supposed to be I do, meaning I'm not being forced into this marriage. Now, of course, lots of brides were forced into marriage, but this is the church trying to end arranged marriages. And the church also does things with inheritance. So they discourage corporate ownership of land. They want it to be tied to the individual. And that's because they want the individual to be able to give it to the church when he or she dies. And they also try to end collateral inheritance, so they're tying everything to the lineage. A lot of this is outlined in this famous book by Jack Goody, but lots of historians, as well as folks in our lab, have followed up on this, and I think it holds together pretty well. Okay, so the scientific endeavor that we wanted to get to was, can we link this stuff in a systematic and statistical way, where we can link the church's marriage and family policies to kinship, link kinship to psychology, and then, of course, if those two are true, this should also be true. You should be able to use the time under the Roman Catholic Church to predict things about psychology. So this is a paper we published in 2019 in Science Magazine. I'm just giving you a quick look at the psychology before we get back to the patents. So here, does the church affect kinship? Now, this is global data, because this is all going to apply to the globe. More centuries under the medieval church, less cousin marriage around the world. Over here, this is going from kinship to weird psychology. More cousin marriage, less individualism, less trust in strangers, less cooperation with strangers. And then you can go this way, and more centuries under the medieval church, more individualism, and more trust in strangers, impersonal psychology, more analytic thinking, a few other things. So that just gives you a picture it holds globally. Now, in this paper, we also dig in and we compare regions within European countries in the same way I'm about to do with patents. But in the interest of time, we're going to gloss over that. The key piece of data we have here is we went into archives composed by historians, and we created a database. And this gives the location and date of the founding of bishoprics throughout Europe. So bishoprics are the center of administration that the church was placing throughout Europe as it expanded and tried to consolidate what became known as Christendom. And you can see that it disappears in certain places. So here in southern Italy, it's around 800. There's the bishoprics are gray. That's because a political power unfriendly to the bishop in Rome, the Pope, took over. You can see this happens in southern Italy. That's the Reconquista eventually turns everything red, but for a while things are gray. So this is going to be an important tool for us. Now, if you make dosages, you can use this as a dosage that each region of Europe got from the church by the end of the Middle Ages. And I'll put this to work a little bit. Okay, just to show you a quick look. So this is more exposure to the medieval church, and this is more patents per capita. So the longer a region of Europe was under the medieval church, the more patents per capita they produce. There's the same thing, but inventors per capita. Now, I'm using inventors here because I'm about to go to creative individuals, and so I just want to show you that these two tell the same story. So this is just variation within Europe, right? All right, now, good reason to be skeptical of this. I could have been hunting around for cool-looking correlations, it's just a correlation. So the puzzle in our lab was how can we measure innovation over history? But then we found that historians and data scientists had put together a giant database of 2 million famous people going around the globe and back into history. So we took the portion of that data in Europe from 0 to 2000. It gives us tens of thousands of individuals. And we divided them into 2 categories. Now, we made no judgments here. We just followed what they gave us, right? They don't know about our hypothesis. They didn't know we were going to do this research. But we put authors, artists, inventors, and scientists in a category we called creatives. And then we put non-creatives in, your generals, your nobles, your kings, your clerics, people like that. Now, like Thomas Aquinas is in creatives. So if you did something very creative and you're a cleric, you get stuck in the creatives. If you're just a boring cleric and you didn't do anything interesting, then you get stuck here. Or maybe you went to war or something like that, then you get stuck here. And so this gives us variation across space and time. Okay. Now, this is called an event study in economics. So we have the arrival of these bishoprics in certain places, and for that grid cell in Europe, we know whether that grid cell was producing creatives before that and non-creatives, and we know what happens after it. So the question is, when the church arrives, does the rate of creatives go up over time? And so this is before. So economists would point out now there's no pre-trends. So it could be the church was going, that place seems to be growing. That's a really good, let's put a bishopric there. If that were true, we would see this thing going up. But we see this thing completely flat. And in fact, it stays flat after. And that's 100 years go by, it's ticking up. 150, even more, 200, now it's significant. So it goes up and you get more creatives after your bishopric arrives. That's what non-creatives do. So this is a control for population size, because you might think, well, it's a center, it's going to produce lots of famous people. Or maybe they can write stuff, so they're going to write stuff down that's going to cause famous people. But that should affect non-creatives. So we see this effect. Now, this is a fancy econometric analysis called a triple diff and diff. What it does is it tries to count all the different factors that are at play, and economists will usually give you a causal inference on this one. But it just strikes me more evidence that this is a real effect here. So after about, 250 years, it's clear that there's a significant effect. And this is supposed to account for all the different things that could go wrong with the causal inference. So you get relatively more famous creatives compared to non-creatives. And it keeps going up almost over the entire period. Okay, now my argument is that this church, unwittingly, and the church didn't intend to do this, but by dismantling the kinship structures of Europe, it freed people so they could move away from their ancestral lands, so they weren't tied with the responsibilities of family and family loyalty, and they could go interact with people in other places. And indeed, these at least famous people did move around a lot, because we have the births and deaths of the famous people. So we can create a social network by using where people were born and where they died. And this is the year 500. And the size of these dots is a network measure called centrality. And it's just the number of other spots that are coming into you as in a network. So the bigger the dot, the more incoming connections you have. And you can kind of see the Roman Empire here. Right? There's Rome, of course, the biggest dot. We didn't put any of the cities in. They just appear. We have Europe divided up into 1.5 degree by 1.5 degree grids. And we just put everyone in those grids. And the cities all pop up naturally without us making any assumptions. So you get that. All right. Then you go to the year 1000. Suddenly you have a much larger collective brain. There's a lot more flow of people in these different areas. And then finally 1500. The external connections kind of disappear. Europe consolidates into this very dense, interconnected, what I would argue, collective brain. All right. And then you can ask the question, does the arrival of the church lead to greater centrality? So does it cause a grid to have more incoming links in terms of people moving to it or away from it? And you get this effect. So you see the same kind of story. The church arrives and suddenly people start moving around. And your likelihood of moving only occurs if there's a bishopric in this grid and a bishopric in this grid. Then suddenly people start moving between the two. Okay. Now, at this point, a sensible argument could be, well, maybe it doesn't have to do with the kinship. Maybe the church was doing something else. So a sensible thing for the past might have been, well, everybody could write in Latin then, or at least not everybody. The famous creative people could write in Latin, so they're transferring ideas, and Latin was the key thing. That's not going to help you with patents, because, of course, nobody writes in Latin now. But it could play a factor. So what we did is we also have the historical data on these councils or synods. And what we have from each of these synods that occurred in different parts of Europe is we have the location, so GPS coordinate, put it on the map. We have the year, we have the agenda, so what did they talk about? And we have the attendance record, so we have which bishops came. And so two key things are coded. Did your bishop attend? And was the marriage and family program or incest legislation discussed? And some didn't. So if we're right, if your bishop attended and they discussed marriage and the family, then that should lead to the effects we think are happening. Otherwise, we shouldn't see any effects. So this is the number of years before the first incest council attended by your bishop. And we see more of a delayed effect, but we do see the effect of increasing centrality. So if your bishop, and if we do it for councils that didn't involve incest legislation or marriage in the family, those have no impact, so those are flat. So that allows us, that suggests that there's really something going on with the marriage and family councils as opposed to all the other councils. I'll show you more on that in a second. Okay, sorry about this regression table. I didn't know how else to show this result. What we're looking at here, so this is the effect of church exposure. And these are just showing that no matter how you write the statistics, you're getting a positive effect of more church exposure is leading to more patents per capita. And in this one, we're comparing only regions within provinces, say, within European states. So it's a very small set of comparisons. This is the key one, though. If your bishop attended, the number of councils that your bishop attended leads to more patents over and above the church exposure. So I can explain why that's the case, but you can think of it as a booster shot because you don't get any, you don't get your bishop attending a council unless you already have a bishopric. So in some sense, you can think of this as so if you have medieval church exposure and your bishop attends the thing, you get this sum of those two coefficients effect. But if your bishop attends other councils, he's a good bishop, he goes to the meetings, but it's not about marriage and the family, no effect at all. So there's that. All right. So the idea here is that by the spread of the Catholic Church, specifically the Catholic Church, because of how it modified the social structure at the grassroots without realizing it, opened the door to the free movement of people because they were no longer tied to all the things that go along with intensive kinship. And this inadvertently led to rising levels of innovation and economic growth that eventually carry through to the Industrial Revolution and even into the modern world. So this is in the category of deep legacy because there's still, if you want to understand the nature of innovation in modern Europe, you need to know about incest councils. Okay, more broadly, I got into this because I was thinking about innovation back in human evolutionary history. And when you think about hunter-gatherers, people often think of the isolated band. But what the most successful group, say in Australia, did was they had communal rituals where they would periodically get together to do rituals together because they believed it was ritually important. And this would bring people together and they'd build bonds and they'd exchange technological information. Many of them also had rules that said you had to marry only a woman who didn't speak your language. So that means you can't marry any local women. You have to build a marriage bond with someone more distant. So now you're creating a network among many different bands and you're maintaining your technological complexity. One of the cases I pointed to is cases where hunter-gatherers got isolated. Famously, the polar Inuit got isolated in northern Greenland. And they started losing fancy technologies right and left. And it wasn't until they reconnected to the rest of the sort of Inuit collective brain that they reabsorbed the same technologies that they once had. So it's an important case of that. And then finally, there's this more general issue of thinking about the collective brain. And this is just kind of a commentary. I think because of weird psychology, the emphasis on individuals and dispositionalism, thinking about people as explaining their behavior based on dispositions, and analytic thinking, where we explain things by talking about the properties of objects. These are all characteristics of weird thinking. This causes us to want to explain things like innovation and lots of other stuff by focusing on the individual. And here I'm saying that leads you astray. You need to focus on this larger network, which is where all the action is. And this is important beyond innovation because, so I got interested in a lot of stuff early on in my career because I was doing behavioral economics. And in those experiments, you always isolate the subject in the lab and you make them make a decision by themselves, like about a risk or something like that, without any interaction from others. But then when I would do ethnography, that's not how anybody actually made decisions. They would walk around and talk to 50 different people before they would make a decision, and they're reflecting and they're talking and they're arguing. And that's how they would make a decision. But economists don't study decision making like that. So that seems to be expanding out the kind of general point here. I'd like to highlight that. And finally, I want to mention that culture affects our perception and how we reason. So that's going to be important. And in the collective brain, you want to take advantage of these different thinking styles that we find among diverse populations. So things like immigration can really lead to rapid innovation, and I showed that this morning in with regard to patenting. And finally, last I'll mention cultural epistemologies. So it's often taken as given that what our standards of evidence are and our standards of a good argument are universal or everyone would agree. But it's only relatively recently, with the emergence of scientific epistemology, that we think dreams aren't a kind of evidence, or that we don't use divination as a way of knowing, or that we don't think the ancient sages and wise men of the past have a particular say in something, where it all comes down to what's the evidence, what's the evidence. That's what scientists are always pushing. So that is a particular way of thinking and organizing the world that has only evolved relatively recently. One of my students, Kevin Hong, and I looked at rainmaking rituals in China, and those only came to an end after 2,000 years of state-sponsored rain rituals, when people just sort of no longer accepted the epistemology that there were gods that could control the rain that you could appeal to. They didn't run the numbers, and the funny part of this is Kevin and I went to the Chinese text, the official histories, and we ran the numbers. And if they had done that, they would have kept doing the rituals. Because maybe there's reporting bias, but whatever it was, the rain rituals are effective if you use the data that's in the official histories. So, all right, that is all I have. I put up this Adam Smith quote too, so we can put that up in the background.
Come sit down, and we now have a Q&A session. I'm going to start it off, and then I'm going to open it up both to people online and in the room. If you're online, there is a box at which you can enter your questions, and if they're approved, they will get submitted through to me. If they're not, we'll leave that aside for a moment. If you're in the room, then please wave your hand, and a mic will be brought to you. But I wanted to start, Joe, by asking about, you've talked quite a lot about the link between religion and innovation. And I found that interesting and relevant in the particular Scottish context where we are. And most people probably pass John Knox's house on the way down to Adam Smith's house. And one of the things that seems very clear is if you want to be rich, it's pretty good to be brought up in a culture that's predominantly Judeo-Christian. And it's even better than that to be brought up in one that's Protestant. And when I looked at your map, I saw that the countries that were going to be rich and prosperous seemed to be in Italy. And if I looked to the north, I didn't see that. But actually, we know that the Industrial Revolution happened in Britain rather than in Italy. And I remember I went to university, and, well, I also remember recently, Bernard Arnault suddenly appeared as the world's richest man, Frenchman, of course. And I asked, so what religion is the Arnault family historically? And I knew what the answer was going to be, and it was Protestant. And what's very striking, if you look at entrepreneurship in France, is how in a country where Protestants have always been a small minority, it is predominantly Protestant. And I was brought up in Edinburgh, and the Church of Scotland, went religiously to Kirk and Sunday school. And I only learned that a foundational doctrine of the Church of Scotland was predestination when I went to university, and I was made to read Weber's Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. And he told me that it was because of predestination. And I came to think that it's not to do with specifics of doctrine. It's actually to do with the broad cultural environment. And there's a mutually reinforcing story between the way in which the religious doctrine evolves and the way in which the broader culture of the society evolves. And the remarkable thing about Scotland, which I had described earlier, how it had been an extraordinary phase of economic development and intellectual development. And it seemed to me irresistible to connect that to the fairly extreme form of Protestantism that was adopted from Scotland from the 17th century.
Yeah, so, and I write a little bit about Scotland in The Weirdest People in the World. And I think the key thing, so Scotland, one of the things that may have led to the Scottish Enlightenment is early publicly funded education. So Scotland was one of the earliest places to have that, and that came with Protestant. Then the question is, well, why did Protestants care about public education? And the reason is the doctrine of sola scriptura. So the idea that each person as an individual should be able to read the Holy Scriptures for themselves. This led to the vernacular, the market in Bibles and whatnot. And this, I think, well, so when you read Weber, I'm like, how did you ever get to a religion where people thought that every schmuck should have the chance to read the Holy Scriptures? And it seems obvious to us, right? Of course everyone should. But that's not how the picture you would get in ancient societies, complex ancient societies. There are highly educated, people who have gone through all this training, and only then could you possibly be allowed to read the Holy Scriptures and make sense of them for yourselves. And we, the learned scholars, will tell you what you should think about these Holy Scriptures. But Protestantism was so individualistic and also very focused on mental states that it led to this need for a public education, and then it gets transferred to Scotland, and so this has a big effect. So part of the story in The Weirdest People in the World with the diffusion of the church is creating a world with enough individualism and enough focus on mental states and the importance of occupation, free movement among occupation, that you would open the door to Protestantism. One of the things I try to emphasize in Weirdest People in the World, there were a bunch of Protestant-ish movements. That one popped up within the church, another one popped up and got smushed. I mean, the church was always trying to smush them, right? So you're going to have a bunch of failed starts. And then finally, Martin Luther got going, and this event. Okay. And then we can use the church to. So I think there's a trail. I haven't actually done all the work to connect this, but the church's decisions lead to Protestantism, highly individualistic, faith-centered, mental state-centered, reifying the occupation, importance of labor. Work is sort of purifying. I have evidence for all that in the book. So that then leads to Protestantism. But then once you have Protestantism, where everybody can have their own opinion and read the whole, then you get lots of sects, and then one of those sects is atheism. And because I'm free to have that opinion if I want to.
Yeah, you know the Scottish joke that when two churches in Scotland unite, you end up with three.
Right. Yeah, so that fits. That fits the picture.
And it was very striking, I thought, when you put up in one of your last slides, individualism, dispositionism, and analytic thinking, that these are precisely the characteristics that the Protestant sects, and particularly the more extreme Protestant sects, diverge from the Catholic mainstream on.
Right.
So there's the other element of that is a word that I find myself using more and more, which is the pluralism, which was a very clear distinction between Protestant and Catholic, and a distinction between more extreme and less extreme forms of Protestantism, the more pluralism that you lied. And that's pretty closely connected, I suspect, to your innovation.
Is it pluralism, the idea that we're going to communally lead this congregation? Is that the idea? We all have a say in how things go?
Or that we encourage people to have ideas of their own and to resist the imposition of a central authority.
Yeah, so this is that feels like an expansion of some of the ideas I was mentioning. Yeah, so that seems right.
But I go on. Well, one of the things I've discovered when I talk about some of the ideas you've been describing is that people say, oh, of course, this is just the wisdom of crowds. And I think it's different from that. And I'd like to put that to you and get you to explain it
Sure.
for the benefit of people here.
So what I think you mean by the wisdom of crowds is just this notion that if all of us, so this is the mathematicians will know it as the Condorcet-Jory theorem. So if we're all partially informed and we all make our guess and we take the average of those guesses or the plurality of those guesses, that will give us the right answer more likely.
That's the famous Galton experiment.
Yeah, that's
where he went to a country fair at which people were asked to guess the weight of an ox. And there's some argument about whether it was the mean or the median of all the guesses. But at any rate, both were rather close to the actual weight of the ox, even though the guesses were extremely diverse.
Yeah, and it's a very reliable effect. So, you know, it's been replicated lots of times. You can do it in class with a jar of marbles and have the students guess. And most guesses will be wildly off, but if you average them, you'll get closer to the actual number. So that is the logic that underpins one type of cultural learning, which is called conformist transmission. And when we look out into the world, if there doesn't appear to be many differences among individuals, you're probably smart to do whatever the majority's doing. Because, you know, because of this Condorcet-Jory theorem idea. We've done simulations and stuff. But all this leaves out the fact that people use all these other cues, like who's the most successful. They might integrate just among the most successful, and they might copy heuristics and strategies and whatnot. And then this is cumulative over time. So the usual story of wisdom of crowds doesn't take into account the cumulative nature of cultural evolution.
And our religious discussion has already given a rise to a couple of questions online, one of which is, isn't it a bit of a stretch to suggest that the 1560 Reformation in Scotland gives rise to the Enlightenment 2 centuries later? And the other is that the influence of the church is much less today in places like Scotland. What's the implication of that on the...
Well, the reason why the influence of the church is less is the effect I described, where by breaking down the families, you led to this extreme individualism, which leads to Protestantism, which leads to atheism, right? So it's a chain. So that's part of it. What's the other part of the question? Oh, is this Scotland?
Yes, it's diminished.
Yeah, well, I'll offer that as a suggestion. I haven't run down that. I thought, seems plausible, right? For earliest public education and early enlightenment. I don't know.
And I think the way you're describing it, it's not actually the religion itself that matters. It's the way in which the religion interacts with the culture in the way you describe. Which was my observation, that although it was only Weber, not the minister, who told me about predestination, the things that followed from that were part of what one was taught and imbibed.
I mean, so they've done research in Germany, and Germany has an interesting situation where various parts of Germany either became Protestant or Catholics due to what might be arguably an arbitrary decision by the Duke in the 16th century. So you can look at work hours today, and you can predict the differences in work hours among different parts of Germany depending on what your local prince decided, whether you're going to be Catholic or Protestant. Protestants work longer.
But we also do see some of these relationships breaking down as religion breaks down. So that some of the growth success stories in Europe, for example, have been Ireland and Poland, where the influence of the traditional Catholic Church has diminished very rapidly. And the gap between the Protestant Catholic areas of Holland, for example, has also disappeared, essentially, but only in the post-war European Union area.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention, people often bring up Italy, but the theory actually works quite well in Italy. Because people think of Italy as a unit that was all under the Catholic Church. But really, southern Italy was often not under the Catholic Church. They were under the Greek Orthodox, or sometimes they were controlled by Islamic powers. So if you look at Sicily, which is not known for the banking, the emergence of banking or the Renaissance, it's known for the mob. Quite a different history happened there. And then if you take the rates of cousin marriage across 93 Italian provinces, in the 20th century, you can use that to predict corruption. You can use that to predict voluntary blood donations, amount of money people keep in banks. There's a whole bunch of things where the story fits quite well, I think.
Let me open up from the floor.
So, one quick point about Scotland. One quick point about Scotland, one could argue that the importance of education predates Reformation. So 1496, I think, to my knowledge, the oldest compulsory education act in Europe would have been James IV that said that all the heirs, so the oldest children of the landlords, have to go to school and perfect Latin and law. And Scotland has 3 universities by the time of Reformation, whereas England, 10 times bigger, had only 2. But my question goes to one social group which seemed to have managed to get away with cousin marriages, and that was the royalty. Usually they got the dispensation and then they married very often. How did church allow it, and does it relate to another weird thing, namely primogeniture? As far as I know, also something rather rare. I mean, most societies, there is an election, they can come from the same family, but you don't necessarily have just one oldest person getting it. So was it kind of linked?
Yes. So let's see. The basis of the question is, give me the question again. So.
Primogeniture and why royal families got the dispensation.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, the royal families. So the church actually did crack down on royals and elites throughout its history, and this led to all kinds of conflicts. So famously, William the Conqueror of England was excommunicated by the Pope because he married, I think, Eleanor or one of the ladies from Aquitaine, and he excommunicated them both, and they got back in by building abbeys for the church. So basically, you had to pay off, right? And dispensations are an idea that got started later. So first the church banned cousin marriage, and then later they decided they could charge people for it. And they could also charge for divorces and annulments and all, so that became a whole business, right? But yeah, that's something that comes later. And it shows that there was a continued demand for marrying your relatives that continued on. I mean, you can see this in Iceland and other places. I don't know about primogeniture. I mean, I think that's an important part of the story, but it's not clear exactly how it fits into my narrative.
Any more from the floor of the audience?
Thanks for a great talk there. It was very interesting. I'm wondering how you view the world today and increasing, what the right word might be, integration with technology. How do you view, in light of the way that you're viewing religion, and sure it was an unintended consequence, your hypothesis, right, that we kind of develop collective brains through that. How do you view the consequences of our integration with technology today for the collective brain? Do you think we're going to get a far more developed one as a result of technology, or do you think in some ways we might regress as a result and lose some of that progress?
Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly the technology holds the potential to increase the size of our collective brains because of our ability to connect with people around the world, translate across languages and stuff. And some of I'm writing a book now, and I'm reviewing some of the stuff that shows the increased importance and effectiveness of remote collaborations. So people collaborate not only with folks at their own university, but now they have more and more extended collaborations. And that seems to have a positive effect. It doesn't seem that remote collaborations can replace the face-to-face, because there still seems to be a lot of important stuff that's done face-to-face, and especially serendipitous interactions where people swap ideas unexpectedly. So you don't have full replacement there. Related to this is the AI question, and the early research suggests that AI could improve individual creativity by generating additional ideas, but of course if people rely too much on that, then they could stop. So either of those could go either way. The other thing that's the case with remote connection is humans still have to trust each other and have to be willing to share our ideas. So you can imagine a world where people stop sharing their good ideas but keep stealing other people's. And then if everybody does that, nobody's sharing. And yeah.
But if it was an aggregate of individual intelligences, then you've rightly made us skeptical about individual intelligence. But actually AI is that? I mean, is it a collective intelligence? Could it be a collective intelligence in the sense in which you mean it?
You mean, could you imagine a whole bunch of AI systems interlinked and swapping ideas?
Yeah.
Sure. Didn't think so, huh?
I find it more of a stretch.
Oh, okay.
There, a question from the back.
Yeah, just to reiterate, a fantastic talk. I'm just curious, do you think technology then, just following up from the previous question, is now replicating sort of the role of Catholicism of the medieval period, where it's laying the groundwork for facilitating a massive sea change in how we operate?
Yes, but I think that's just part of a much longer running. So one of the things in the book I'm writing I review is just the effect of railroads, say in the United States. Once a town got wired into the railroad system, it suddenly went up in its patents per capita. And that's just because you have inflow and outflow of ideas. When London got a mail system, so Newton gets inspired to study universal gravitation because he gets a letter from Robert Hooke. So Hooke had to have a mail system. And this mail system was only a few decades long. He couldn't have written a letter to Newton before that. So yeah, so anything that allows people to interconnect can facilitate this process. One thing, though, I should mention is, and I usually leave it out, it's possible to be too interconnected. Now, and here's the reason. So imagine there's 3 different solutions to a problem, but one is the best solution, the other 2 are suboptimal. If the first solution you find is one of the suboptimal ones, if you immediately share that with everyone can go to the suboptimal solution. And then it could require you to go down a hill in terms of effectiveness before you can climb the next higher peak. Is that making sense? Let me give you a concrete example. So electric cars, there were lots of electric cars around in 1900. But when Ford put out the Model T, it was better than any of the electric cars, so everybody invested in fossil fuels. And soon, there was no way for electric cars to get started because the fossil fuel cars were just so much better. So this development got arrested. If things had happened a little bit differently, we might have been driving electric cars the entire 20th century. So it just depends which one takes off. If you have a disparate group with lots of people working on stuff, one group might go to the suboptimal peak, and then one of the other groups might go to the optimal peak, and then it's easy to transfer. But if everybody just copies whatever the current best thing is, it could lead you down the wrong trail. So that's an argument for not complete interconnectedness. The reason why I don't usually mention that is, throughout most of human history, too much interconnectedness has not been a problem. Groups are always falling apart and fragmenting and breaking. But in the modern world, with all this technology, it could actually be a problem. People might search for the solution and use some suboptimal instead of trying to figure out a new way to do it and finding something that nobody's thought of.
And we hear a lot more worry about social media being self-reinforcing of views of people already hold, right, rather than introducing them to new views.
Yeah, and that's so people go out and look for to reinforce their own beliefs, right? So it's potential downside.
I'm interested in the application of collective intelligence and ideas related to that, to the development of firms. And I find it very powerful to see your emphasis on combination and recombination as the nature of the way in which firms evolve and develop over time, which is a very different argument from the kind of way that the firms have normally been defined in the economics literature in terms of a markets versus hierarchies distinction, or indeed in terms of the heroic CEO, who, rather like the heroic inventor, imposes his will on the corporation. I don't know if you have anything to add or comment on that kind of thinking.
There's a literature in organizational behavior that looks a lot like, it seems to be independent, but it looks a lot like a lot of the social learning I talked about, where firms copy other firms. And if a firm does really well, other companies, other firms will copy all kinds of things from that. So you get the diffusion of these poison pill management and matrix management and all these different management fads that just spread around because of prestige bias and these other kinds of things. And so each firm is a recombination of ideas taken from other firms.
Well, we've had a wonderful afternoon and a great discussion, and I think we've all learned a great deal from you. I have a prize to give you to take away.
Thank you.